Good morning and welcome to Ask Andy. This is a daily podcast about personal injury practice in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I'm Andrew Neuwirth. You can reach me on the web at Neuwirthlaw, NEUWIRTHLAW.com. So I wanted to talk to you today about reviewing medical records, which is something I talk about periodically, but it's an important part of what I do, and it's something that most clients don't really, pick up on as part of, an important part of the case. Certainly the lawyers on both sides look very closely at medical records. The defense lawyers usually have, either within their firm or through their insurance company, have a complete timeline laid out when I sit across the table from them at depositions. So that tells you that it's important to them just as much as it is to us. So today, or yesterday actually, I read through about 300 or 400 pages of medical records that occurred in a car accident case I'm working on where a guy died. But there's about a 2-week break between the accident and the death, and my job is essentially, over the course of 2 months' time it's going to take me to collect all the medical records for this patient from day one to date of death. And then I have to look at them and figure out, what happened, and then draw some conclusions from those records. Now, how does that really work out? Well, first of all, it's a pain getting records. We're like last on the food chain in terms of medical records services. So hospital's priority is usually to service the doctors in the hospital, then to service outside providers and insurance companies. Lawyers are down at the bottom of the list there. So it takes a while to get, records, and once you get them, you got to be able to sort of sit down and figure out where they fit. Are they significant? Are they not significant? Are they insignificant? Sometimes there's a lot in there, sometimes there's not. A lot of times when you're looking at records, they reveal other medical providers that you have to chase down then and say, oh, this person had, a dentist appointment. Did he make the dentist appointment? Was he feeling well enough to go to the dentist? What did he tell the dentist? Maybe he told the dentist that, he was totally fine. That may be harmful for your case. Sometimes there's home care providers. Those home care providers, sometimes they keep notes, sometimes they don't. It just depends on the provider. Oftentimes, nursing notes are, in the old days, they were handwritten. They were much more informative about what was going on in the hospital. In the old days, I mean 5-10 years ago. Now, almost every hospital record I see is electronic and computerized, and you lose that sort of, nurse at bedside flavor because you're just getting someone's type notes. What matters in medical records a lot is kind of sometimes the fine details. Oftentimes a doctor will write a note, which is basically just, a narrative about what they're seeing in the patient. Sometimes they get the facts of the car accident wrong, and sometimes that makes trouble for me, but really what you're getting is sometimes a real-time description of how the patient's feeling. His pain is 5 out of 10. He's not complaining about leg pain. He's complaining about not being able to, breathe well or chew his food fully or sleep well. So you never know how these things are going to play out. They begin to form a picture of what you're looking for. And, that's the important part of what I'm doing right now in this particular case, is just trying to put the pieces together and get the timeline together so I can understand what happened. Now, why does that matter? Well, I've already talked to the insurance company on this case, and I know that they do not believe there's any connection between the accident and the death. So what's my job? My job is to figure out if I'm right that there is a connection, and then, how to prove it. And third, what's the other piece? The other piece is what's the lawyer going to say on the other side? I don't really care what the claim rep is going to say, because I know she's going to say no, 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 and there's a lot of money at stake, so I know that she's never going to pay me what I want to get paid on this case. So, essentially I'm just preparing my case to move it in towards litigation, but before I go to litigation, I want to make sure I'm right, because I'm going to spend, probably $15,000 to $20,000 to pursue this case without a client, really, because the gentleman's dead. So, when you have a deceased client, usually you have a family member or a friend or a daughter or a grandparent or who's someone around to speak for them to some extent. But the medical records really have to paint the entire picture of what happened. You can't have big gaps in time, because then your client can't come in and say, oh yeah, I wasn't feeling well, all right, my insurance lapsed, I didn't have money to do this, or I had to go to work. You don't have that luxury with someone who's dead, so you have to be able to prove your case entirely through the medical records and account for all possible weaknesses there. So it's a little bit of a dicey proposition. There's something called the dead man's rule, and you got to be careful about, the client said this or said that. You got to understand that you can bring in the client's doctors and nurses to talk about what he was feeling, what he was saying, and what his records showed. And, ultimately I'll have an expert who pulls it all together for a jury if that's necessary. But I can sort of start to see the picture developing of, what's happening in this particular case. I have another death case or two, and the death cases are interesting. Everyone takes them very seriously because someone died. They don't believe that anyone really, a jury and insurance, no one's going to say that someone intended this person to die. But at the same time, you really need to pull together significant pieces of evidence, far more so than you would when you have a living client, because you have to make sure that you can prove everything before you go all the way down to trial and lose because you can't prove your case. So, the families take these cases more seriously, but lawyers on both sides take these cases more seriously. And, my job as kind of the point person is to make sure before we go into court that we have our ducks in a row, and we're not making a judgment call that we're missing something. But at the same time, the person's not going to get any more dead, so there's a bit of an urgency in my thinking, at least, to move the case towards litigation, because as long as you have their records, there's really no reason to delay putting the case into court. The person's, it's not a situation where someone's back pain is going to get better or worse. They're dead. That's it. You know what the injury is, move on. So, usually these cases come into the office, and, I'll put them into suit, usually if I can within 3 or 4 months, just because that means I've gotten most, if not all, the records. I've got a good idea of what the case is about, and I've got a good sense of where it's going to go, and there's no reason to delay, because delay is just wasting time. Delay is a time I could be spending sitting on the court calendar in Philadelphia, kind of running the time off the clock, because Philly cases are pretty much on a clock. And, they can sit in my case file in my office, or they can move forward in court. So, that decision's easy. But it really is, it's not a hard thing sometimes. If you're well trained in reading medical records, it's not that hard to do. You got to sit down, you got to read them, kind of with a fine-tooth comb. I dictate summaries for myself, so I don't have to read them over and over again. They're covered in my, yellow highlighter and tabs. But, it gives you a general picture of what happened. Sometimes experts look at them and have a different read on things, or think that what I think is significant is not. Sometimes they find things that are very significant that I didn't even notice. But that's why we have experts, and that's why, sometimes these cases get expensive, because you got to be able to explain the whole thing. So that's enough for today. This podcast is sponsored by Neuwirth Law Office, a King of Prussia, Philadelphia suburb law firm, which pursues plaintiffs' personal injury cases only. If you need me or you want to talk to me, you can get in touch with me through Facebook, or through LinkedIn, or through, Facebook Messenger, or by phone to 215-259-3687. We are on day 60 or so of lockdown for COVID avoidance, and I hope you're safe and stay well.